What is real? Most people ask that question once. In a philosophy class, in a dark night that eventually ends, in a moment of grief or disorientation that passes, and then gets filed away under things we don't think about anymore. And then they move on. Philip K. Dick never moved on. He asked it every day for 53 years. Not as an abstract exercise, not as intellectual entertainment, as a survival question, as something personal, urgent, and impossible to put down. He wrote 40 novels trying to answer it. He wrote 8,000 private pages trying to answer it. He gave a lecture in France in 1977 that left his audience not knowing whether to applaud or call someone. And on March 2nd, 1982, alone in his apartment, the Exegesis unfinished on his desk, he died. Still asking. But before we get to him, I want to ask you something. You know that feeling. The one that arrives in the moments just before sleep. In the 3 a.m. hours, when the noise of ordinary life finally drops, and something underneath it becomes almost audible. In the strange coincidences that don't feel like coincidences. The moments when you look at the version of reality you've been handed. The jobs, the screens, the history you were taught, the map of what is possible and what isn't. And something in you, quietly, doesn't believe it. Not all of it. Just enough to make you keep watching videos like this one, at hours when you should be doing something else. Philip K. Dick didn't just feel that. In February 1974, he saw it. Clearly, completely, for several days. And what he saw was so specific, so structured, so internally consistent, that he spent the rest of his life doing the only thing a person can do when they have seen something that has no category. He documented it. Every night, until the end. This is the story of Philip K. Dick. And by the time this series is over, you may not be sure what to do with what you've heard. Here is the first strange thing. When Philip Dick was born, on December 16, 1928, he was a twin. His sister Jane died 6 weeks later, and when Jane was buried in Fort Morgan, Colorado, her tombstone was inscribed with both their names, Philip's name, and a blank space where his death date would go. That grave waited for him for 53 years. When he died in 1982, his ashes were taken to Fort Morgan and buried next to Jane. The blank space was finally filled in. Think about what that means. A grave with your name on it exists from the moment you are born, waiting. Dick knew about it, and he sometimes wrote about something stranger than grief, the suspicion that in some other version of reality, it was Jane who had survived. That Jane was the one living in California, writing the novels. And he was the one already in the ground. He wrote, "I am half of a being that never got to live. Jane is my other half, and she died before she could become real." That sense of incompleteness, of something essential being absent from the world as given, never left him, and it became the question underneath all his other questions. If the world can take someone before they become real, how real is the world? I want you to sit with that image. A tombstone with 2 names. One filled in immediately, one left blank for 53 years. Most people, when they encounter that detail, move past it quickly. It's sad, it's unusual, and then we get back to the ideas. But I think the grave is the key to everything that follows. Because Dick didn't experience the loss of Jane as a biographical fact. He experienced it as a structural one, as evidence that the world as given was not complete, that something essential had been removed from it before he was old enough to understand what was missing. And that feeling, The feeling that the world is not all there is, that something has been subtracted from it, that a version of reality exists in which what was lost was not lost, is the emotional engine of every novel he ever wrote. It is also, I want to suggest, a feeling many of you know, not necessarily from losing a twin, from any moment where the world is given, failed to contain something you knew should be there. Dick turned that feeling into 53 years of questions. The questions eventually got an answer. He grew up in Berkeley, California, dropped out of college, worked in a record store, started writing, and wrote obsessively, producing novel after novel through the 1950s and 60s at a pace that should have been impossible, in conditions of poverty that would have broken most people. He once said, "We couldn't even pay the late fees on a library book." He married 5 times. He suffered breakdowns. And through all of it, he kept asking the same question. The question that would eventually consume his entire life. What is real? He wrote, "Reality is that which, when you stop believing in it, doesn't go away." That sounds simple, but follow it to the end, and it becomes devastating. Because the implication is that most of what we call reality does go away when you stop believing in it. The institutions, the narratives, the systems, the version of history you were given, the identity you were assigned. Strip away the belief, and most of it dissolves. So the question becomes, what's left when the belief is gone? What is the thing that doesn't go away? Dick spent 40 novels trying to find it. Here is what's interesting about that question when Dick asks it. Most people who ask what is real are asking from a position of comfort. They have a stable life, a stable sense of self. They're asking philosophically, from inside a reality they don't actually doubt. Dick was asking from somewhere else. He was asking from inside instability. From inside a life that kept failing to hold together. And that matters. Because the question hits differently when it comes from there. When you are not anchored in the version of reality everyone around you has agreed to accept, the question is not abstract. It is the most urgent question you have. Think about the moments in your own life when the version of reality you were living failed to hold. When something happened that the map didn't account for. When the consensus of what is normal, possible, and real suddenly felt very thin, like a layer over something else you couldn't quite see. Most people find another framework quickly, another map, another consensus, another version of reality that holds long enough to feel stable. Dick never found one that held, so he kept asking, and the asking, 53 years of it, eventually produced something no map had prepared him for. This is the part that should disturb you more than it usually does. Dick spent 40 years writing what everyone called speculation. Worlds where memories were implanted and no one could tell the difference. Governments that controlled reality by controlling language. People who discovered their entire life history was a manufactured fiction. AIs that became more human than humans. Humans who were revealed to be machines. Time running backwards. Multiple timelines occupying the same space. None of it felt like entertainment to him. He once wrote, "I want to write about people I love, and put them in a world that wrecks them, because that is what God has done to us." He was not writing about the future. He was writing about the present as he actually experienced it, through the only frame he could get people to accept, fiction. And then the things he wrote began to become real. Not loosely, not approximately, structurally. The surveillance state so total that the watchers lose track of which side they're on, confirmed by Edward Snowden in 2013. The fracturing of shared reality into sealed, incompatible versions of what is true, now called the epistemic crisis by every media analyst alive. The AI system that invents pop stars, now called Hatsune Miku, now called AI-generated Drake. The preserved consciousness of the dead, accessible through technology, now called hereafter AI. He wrote all of it, decades before it existed. And in private, in the 8,000 pages no one was supposed to read, he wrote that he hadn't been imagining any of it, that he had been receiving it. There are two ways to sit with what I just said. The first is comfortable. Dick was a brilliant writer with unusual intuitions. He understood human nature, technology, and power well enough to describe where they were heading. That explanation is reasonable, and it lets you keep the world more or less as it is. The second way is harder. What if the things he wrote about kept becoming real because he wasn't describing the future? What if he was describing a structure, a deep structure underneath the surface of reality, that expresses itself in different forms, in different eras, but is always recognizably the same thing? The same mechanisms of control, the same erosion of shared truth, the same question of what is real and who gets to decide. If that's true, then his novels were not imagination, they were perception. The ability to see the structure underneath the surface, before the surface caught up to it. Dick wrote, "We are bombarded with pseudo-realities manufactured by very sophisticated people using very sophisticated electronic mechanisms. I do not distrust their motives. I distrust their power." He was not describing a future threat. He was describing something he had already seen. And in February 1974, whatever he had been seeing finally made direct contact. Here's what actually happened. Dick was recovering from the effects of sodium pentothal, administered for an impacted wisdom tooth. A delivery woman arrived at his door with medication. He opened the door. She was wearing a gold necklace, a fish pendant, the ichthys, the ancient Christian symbol used by early Christians living under Roman occupation to identify each other. When Christianity was a persecuted underground movement, and the wrong symbol in the wrong place could get you killed. As the sun glinted off the pendant, Dick described a beam of pink light that struck him directly, and something broke open. He later told an interviewer, "I experienced an invasion of my mind by a transcendently rational mind, as if I had been insane all my life, and suddenly I had become sane." Read that carefully. Not that he went crazy, the opposite. As if the ordinary state, the consensus reality he had been living inside for 45 years, was the insanity. And what broke through was the first moment of clarity he had ever experienced. What followed, across February and March of 1974, was a series of experiences he called 2374. Ancient Greek he hadn't studied. Visions of Rome superimposed over California. A garden, luminous and ancient, flickering at the edge of perception. And information. Specific, verifiable, accurate information, including a medical diagnosis of a condition in his infant son that doctors had missed. He identified an inguinal hernia. He insisted doctors examine his son. The hernia was real. It was serious. It required surgery. A destabilized mind can produce vivid experiences. That's true. But a destabilized mind cannot produce accurate medical diagnoses of conditions the person has no training to identify. So the answer is, something was transmitting information to him. What it was, is where the next 4 episodes begin. I want to name something directly. The comfortable explanation for what Dick experienced is a combination of factors. The sodium pentothal, the stress, the instability of his life at that point. Dick applied that exact argument to himself, repeatedly, across 8,000 pages, and he could not make it fully account for the hernia. Because the hernia is the detail that the comfortable explanation cannot absorb. You can explain away a vision. You can explain away a feeling of significance. You can explain away ancient Greek appearing in the mind of someone who read widely and forgot what he had absorbed. You cannot explain away a correctly identified surgical-grade medical condition in an infant, identified by a man with no medical training, during what he described as an invasion of his mind by a transcendently rational intelligence. Either the diagnosis was a coincidence, and the coincidence saved his son's life, or something was transmitting. Dick spent 8 years trying to determine which. He documented every angle. He dismantled every framework the moment it started to feel too comfortable. And he never settled on a final answer. But he never dismissed the hernia. In 1977, 3 years after February 1974, Dick stood at a podium at a science fiction convention in Metz, France. His audience had come to meet the author of Blade Runner, the man behind Minority Report. And he told them that his novels were not fiction, that he had been writing about a real world, a world layered beneath this one, a world where time was not what it seemed, where an ancient empire had never ended, where an intelligence woven into the fabric of reality had, in February 1974, made direct contact with him. The audience didn't know whether to applaud or call someone. Dick didn't care. He had been trying to tell people for 3 years. Think about what that takes, to stand in front of an audience, assembled around a specific version of you, and tell them that version isn't accurate, that what you have been doing is not what they think, that the question you have been asking your entire life has received an answer, and the answer is stranger than anything you wrote. Most people, when they encounter something that doesn't fit the story everyone around them has agreed to believe, find a way to make it fit. They use softer language. They protect the version of themselves that is legible to other people. Dick stood at a podium in France and refused. Dick died on March 2nd, 1982. He was found on the floor of his apartment in Santa Ana. He had suffered a stroke 5 days earlier and was disconnected from life support after his brain activity had ceased. His ashes were taken to Fort Morgan, Colorado, to the grave that had been waiting with his name on it for 53 years. The blank space was filled in. The twins were buried together. And the Exegesis, 8,000 pages, 8 years of the most relentless self-examination any writer has ever committed to paper, sat unfinished. The last entry ended mid-sentence. In one of his final interviews, he said, "I feel that I am approaching something, not just in my understanding, but in reality itself, as if the answer and the moment it arrives are the same event. I don't know what to do with that feeling, but I can't make it go away." He never found out what it was. Or perhaps, depending on how you read the framework he spent 8 years building, he found out exactly what it was the moment his body stopped generating interference. You came to this video because something in you is asking a question. Maybe not his specific question, but the one underneath it. The one that arrives when the noise drops. The one the version of reality you were handed doesn't quite answer. Dick asked it for 53 years. And in February 1972, something answered back. The next episode is about what it said.